Welcome, everyone. A big thank you for joining us. We're excited to talk through the AI native innovation function today. We'll explore kind of how the innovation function is evolving into an AI native system, not just using tools, but obviously building capabilities that are sensing change and generating insight and adapting in real time. So the goal of today is to talk about what that shift really looks like inside the in-company environment, and of course what it means for the future of innovation teams. So quick introductions from us. I'm Amir, I'm Managing Director at Board of Innovation, and I'm joined by Natasha, who's a leader here in our AI innovation practice, and we're both based out of our New York office here at BOI. So we've spent the last couple of years really helping Fortune 500 and global enterprises design, test, and scale AI-driven innovation capabilities. So everything from insight systems to full-on innovation engines. And what we'll do is today we'll show you really what has directly come from that work, real projects, real data, real kind of transformations in progress. For those that don't know BOI, this is kind of a quick recap of what we do. Our mission is very much to rewire how companies are innovating, marketing, and selling in what we're calling the autonomous age. So what that means is helping global leaders like some of the companies that you see here really think about not just spot tools, but how they can redesign their systems around AI-first capabilities. So we focus on three core growth functions, which are innovation teams, marketing teams, and sales and commercial teams. And all three of those really share one thing in common, which is that they depend heavily on the quality and the speed of intelligence. So we're very much known for working within the growth functions space. And what we've kind of seen over time is that when you actually end up connecting those capabilities from insight generation right through to commercialization, what you actually get is an enterprise that is learning faster than it acts, which is important. So that's the foundation of what we'll unpack today. So usually we like to do kind of a state of play before we jump into the nitty gritty in terms of what we have seen in the last couple of years. And I think there's been a pretty marked shift between these recent eras. So I'd say 2021 to 2023 was really about curiosity, learning about AI from more of a mass adoption perspective. 2024 was really the year of, I would say, the spot tools. So a lot of off-the-shelf tooling, experimenting with it, playing with it, getting a feel for what AI can do. And then 2025 and the latter part of 2024 took a really, I'd say, hard shift into building out those capabilities internally and really starting to think about the workflow, think about integration, think about accessing internal data sources, and thinking about proprietary IP when it comes to AI as a driver of the innovation process. So really interesting to see the pace at which this kind of progression is moving. So we'll share a little bit around why this work has kind of come to be and what's driving so much interest and activity in AI inside innovation teams specifically. And it really does come from two directions, which is what is happening inside organizations and then what's happening around them. So internally, a lot of teams are really under pressure to deliver more outcomes with just fewer steps. So the legacy funnel model and slow validation cycles really are not keeping up. And what that does is it creates a sense of concept fatigue, which is this feeling that, after years of workshops and brainstorming, everything new sounds like a variation of something old. There's also a lot of vendor fatigue. A lot of innovation stacks have kind of become patchworks of unconnected tools and data sources. Each one is solving a small problem, but adding friction overall. And the result is a lot of activity, but not a lot of learning. On the external side of things, the context has really shifted as dramatically. So we've entered this era of kind of insight parity, which is that everyone has access to the same syndicated purchase data, the same agencies, the same trend feeds. So genuine differentiation is actually pretty hard to find. But at the same time, you have early adopters, which we consider those that invested in AI capabilities around 24 months ago-ish, 12 to 24 months ago, they're just moving at an entirely different speed. They're identifying category shifts, they're validating ideas while others are still scoping research projects. So internally, innovation teams are kind of stretched thin, and externally, competitors are really accelerating. And that combination has made AI capability building kind of a strategic necessity instead of just a curiosity. So a phrase that you'll hear a little bit, or a lot, I should say, from us today is this idea of the innovation engine. And when we first started working with enterprise innovation teams on the AI capability, what we found is that the classic funnel, meaning insight to concept launch, was being replaced by something a lot more fluid, which eventually we started to kind of affectionately call the innovation engine. So now we think of it as a little less of an engine and more like an operating system. And we do have to kind of give a shout out to the first two clients that we worked with on this kind of work, which were Walmart and Nestle. And they were really amazing partners with us very early on when this was still an early technology. And we were really able to work closely with them to build out the first AI native innovation capabilities, meaning going from data source to launched concept. I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of this system. And most organizations kind of began in just one small part of the system, which is the point closest to the work they already know, which is concept generation. So using generative tools to create more ideas faster, which did make sense. It was kind of the most visible, and still is the most visible and accessible place to start. You can see the output immediately. You can see names and claims and visuals and pretty high fidelity early product concepts. This stage, I think, while exciting at the time, it was pretty limited. The tools can create, it can kind of help teams create more, but not necessarily better concepts. And what became really clear was that the real value began to appear when we used AI to go upstream. So connecting concept generation back to opportunity discovery and the data itself. So when you connect AI to internal and external data streams, things like market performance and consumer signals and scientific research, the operating system just starts to get a lot smarter. It's generating not just ideas, but actual data-backed opportunities. And that was the real turning point in AI native innovation, moving from generative creativity to generative intelligence. So from making concepts to understanding where and why to make the concepts. Once teams did move past concept generation and started to look at kind of connecting AI to that concept generation and the opportunity discovery, the next evolution was really expanding that capability across the rest of the core innovation system. So this inner ring here. So the three capabilities beyond the concept generation that we're defining are insight differentiation, which is basically using AI to connect and interpret really big fragmented data sets, internal, external data, third-party data. And it's moving away from relying on these kind of purchased trend insights to actually generating your own insight and your own foresight, again, by linking internal, external, and third-party data at scale. The second is intelligent validation. So moving from small kind of late stage consumer tests to large scale simulation. Basically, teams test desirability, viability, feasibility before a prototype even exists. And we'll dig in on each of those a lot more in the rest of this presentation. And the third is adaptive portfolio management. So basically replacing static stage gates with a live system that is continuously rescoring and reprioritizing opportunities based on new data, market demand, competitor activity, or supply chain shifts. And together, each of those forms the foundation of an AI native innovation engine. So it's this loop that is constantly identifying and sensing, testing, adapting. And once that inner system has proved its value, so this ring we have here on the screen, it sets the stage for something much bigger and connects AI to the outer activities across R&D and marketing and commercialization. So that same intelligence that sat inside the innovation function begins to influence the adjacent activities that surround it. And then beyond that, what you have is really a fully connected innovation ecosystem. It's been really exciting and fulfilling to kind of see this come to life within so many companies now compared to how many teams were operating a couple of years ago. But essentially, this ecosystem is where every function is sharing a common intelligence layer. Every action feeds new data back into the system. And what began as an isolated capability for concept generation becomes a much more agentic operating model. So when we're building these capabilities, by the time we've actually reached this second layer, there's hundreds and sometimes thousands of agents at work behind the scenes, which is really cool to watch and really great to see the impact on the quality of innovation that has come from that. I'll share kind of a quick principle before we go deeper, which is that if you want an innovation engine that you can kind of trust and scale, generally you have to build it. So we say this instead of building kind of a generic or buying a generic SaaS tool and putting your data into it. This was a pretty key learning for us over the last kind of 5 years with our clients. The reason being that kind of twofold, actually. One is security, which is that global enterprises really don't want to grant broad access to SaaS companies to their confidential research and roadmaps and consumer data. The leakage and the commingling risks are very real. And then the second is IP ownership, meaning you just don't want your proprietary signals training someone else's product or walking out the door kind of when a vendor changes terms or when you change vendors. So what we've found is that a lot of off-the-shelf innovation tools tend to end up actually feeling pretty underwhelming in practice. We've worked with a lot of them. We are very open. If anyone has suggestions, send them over. It's a space we are monitoring very, very closely. We're not affiliated with any SaaS companies or technology companies. So we're always looking and assessing tools that we think could be helpful for our clients. And just kind of an important clarification at the end there. So when we do say build, what we mean here isn't actually training giant models from scratch. It just means standing up these capabilities in your own environment, meaning having access to your data, living within your security protocols.
Awesome. So we want to just double tap into kind of innovation systems, what they used to look like, and what Amir introduced as kind of the system intelligence. So for decades on end, innovation operated in kind of a linear pipeline. So we used to discover, we used to then develop, and then we used to then deliver. And this linear process was great for markets that were stable, that are predictable, but they don't make sense in today because those assumptions no longer hold. Markets are moving faster than any kind of stage gate system we've seen. So for example, we are seeing kind of data flowing continuously from consumers, from social media platforms, from the market, from competitors. We're seeing entire categories being reshaped overnight by regulations, by cultural trends, by new entrants. And so this is why kind of leading organizations that we've been working with are transitioning from this innovation pipeline to what Amir introduced as the innovation engine, which is the intelligence system that continuously senses, it continuously interprets, acts, simulates, and learns. And we'll dive a bit into exactly what that means in a second. So what we're trying to say is that instead of sequential handoffs, innovation becomes more of a dynamic network of feedback loops. And by that, we mean insights generates triggers for real-time validation. Simulations that we conduct inform how we make decisions, and new outcomes or outputs feeds back into the system to then kind of learn and grow. And so intelligence itself becomes the organizing principle of innovation. So we're not relying anymore on kind of big stage gates or management reviews, but rather we're focusing on kind of living systems. So innovation isn't static, but rather it's a living system that adjusts itself as the kind of conditions evolve and move. And so when we talk about intelligence itself, especially in the context of innovation, we don't just mean automation, we don't just mean faster data processing, we mean a fundamental shift in how organizations learn, decide, and create value. So innovation has three different layers to it. The first is about kind of connected sensing. It's this ability to gather various signals from the markets, from consumers, from competitors, from the performance of your organization itself. And what's really important when we're thinking about kind of connected sensing is that these different signals are not being interpreted in isolation, but they're coming together almost as one single kind of dynamic picture. Second, it's about adaptive reasoning. So our AI systems are able to kind of gather those signals, interpret them, but the kind of true impact is how do you kind of recommend actions and understand those signals and interpret them. And so adaptive reasoning really speaks to the feature around allowing teams to move from static kind of research to a living understanding of what's happening and why. And when we say teams, we're not only talking about innovation teams, we're talking about teams across various functions. So we're breaking down silos and we're talking about teams across different functions who can understand what is happening in the external and internal environment and understand why it's happening. Then lastly, it's about kind of collective learning. So every project you conduct, every experiment, every launch is all data that then feeds back into this operating system that we have and strengthens the next cycle. And so we're essentially creating an intelligent system that is continuously learning, not only from external signals, but from the work that you're kind of doing. So it's an evolving kind of intelligence network. And this changes innovation completely. So we're not only kind of generating concepts and validating them and then shipping them across to R&D or marketing teams, but instead we're creating this engine that continuously is generating clarity. And so clarity is where opportunities are. It allows us to kind of act and allows us to kind of pivot in a smart way.
Awesome. Thanks, Tash. Let's talk a little bit about why this moment is so pivotal before we break down the four pillars of AI native innovation, because this has shifted a lot and I think is the primary driver of why there is so much activity in the innovation transformation space now. So the three big kind of converging moments that we've seen are data accessibility, meaning for many years enterprises have just been sitting on these huge stores of consumer and market and R&D data, but a lot of it was trapped in silos. So over the last, say, 18 to 24 months, we've actually seen real progress in integrating and activating those data sets. We are not saying by any means that most of our clients have perfect data sets and have figured out their data governance in a perfect way by any means, but it has got to a point where the data is accessible enough to be able to give innovation teams an entirely new intelligence foundation to work from and on which to build these capabilities. The second is a model capability, meaning AI systems can now interpret unstructured data, text, images, behavior with such near human contexts that didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago. But this has been paired with the pace of advancements, I would say slowing is maybe the right word, or stabilizing enough that organizations can actually build durable systems on top of these models, not just experiment around them. I think when we look back to the first rounds of GPT, for example, there was such a big model gap between each evolution that has plateaued quite a bit when it comes to building these capabilities. And or being able to build these capabilities on top of these models, meaning they're not shifting so fast that it's affecting the way these capabilities are working. And what we do, for example, whenever we're building these capabilities, is that we make them model agnostic. We really make sure that that semantic layer, that commercial layer, that logic layer is model agnostic. And via the APIs, as the models evolve, the capability evolves with them. Third one is market volatility. And this really comes down to the world just moving a lot faster. I'm sure everyone is feeling it beyond just innovation in this conversation that we're having, but culturally, economically, technologically, the world is moving very, very fast. And innovation cycles that used to last years are now compressing into quarters. That means that organizations really can't rely on static insight decks or annual planning as much anymore. They do need intelligence that moves at the speed of the market. We touched on this point a little bit earlier on about where the industry conversation kind of was before in terms of generative creativity and where it has gone now. And we see a lot of these tools like DALL-E and Firefly and Copilot have exploded with good reason. You know, they've dramatically lowered the barrier to content creation, and now anyone can generate concepts and visuals and copy in minutes, which has been really important in unlocking enthusiasm and buy-in. But it has also created some misconception, meaning often the AI conversation in innovation can kind of stop there at that surface level of idea generation or creative automation, which is valuable, but it's just such a small fraction of AI's real potential in innovation. So what's actually missing is the transformation of the system behind that creativity. So how we're discovering new opportunities, how we're validating concepts, how we're simulating outcomes more successfully. And this kind of generative creativity gives you more ideas, but it's really intelligence-led innovation that is giving you better judgment and data points about which ideas actually matter. So in other words, the real opportunity isn't just creating more, but it's creating with precision, guided by data, guided by predictive modeling, guided by evidence. So that's the shift that we will explore next as we think about what is actually driving successful concept generation. We like to think of this as kind of the 4 pillars of AI native innovation. And it's not completely clean cut, but I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, at least, is that the majority of the really high ROI work within AI native innovation tends to be in one of these four areas. And sometimes companies will tackle one, sometimes they'll tackle multiple. But we definitely have seen that it has kind of whittled down to these 4, where you know reliably that you can build AI capabilities with accuracy that scale across many different brands or different functions. So it's been kind of, I think, exciting to see where these 4 pillars are going. So we touched on them earlier, but it's insight differentiation, portfolio intelligence, simulation and validation, and opportunity sizing, and by association, foresight. And we've kind of seen some evolution in this last one a lot over the last year or two. So together, these pillars form what we call this intelligent innovation system. And it's one that, like we said, is evidence-driven, it's self-learning, and increasingly is actually very predictive as well. So we'll touch on each of these pillars in a little bit more detail. And what we'll do in the future is we'll share out some materials in a lot more detail on each of these. Obviously, we have limited time today, but we'll try and share as much as we can from under the hood of each. So the first is insight differentiation. So where AI is starting to create, I'd say, an actually pretty massive competitive distance with folks that are really investing in this. So traditionally, a lot of big enterprises have relied on syndicated data and vendor research, meaning competitors, as we said earlier, are often drawing from the same insight base. What AI is changing is the ability to integrate really large amounts of internal data, proprietary internal data, external data that previously wasn't accessible at that kind of scale, and third-party data into a single continuously learning intelligence system. So imagine connecting all of your ethnographic studies and CRM data and patent research and social sentiment, R&D, trend subscriptions, all of that into structured models essentially that are analyzing that data and identifying these hidden signals, these hidden relationships, these hidden data points. So AI is fusing that into one semantic intelligence layer is kind of the official term for it. And that's what's making these new signals much more visible. It's a pretty big paradigm shift from buying insights to generating insights. Every insight is now an owned compounding data asset instead of a piece of research that you've purchased that your competitors have also purchased. And over time, it becomes a defensible intelligence layer that other competitors just cannot easily replicate. So there's three key mechanisms that make this possible. Signal fusion and enrichment, pattern and adjacency detection, and defensible knowledge graphs. So signal fusion meaning merging the structured and unstructured data sources to identify new signals. Adjacency detection and pattern detection is uncovering those relationships between different categories, between behaviors that humans just wouldn't be able to spot at scale. And then defensible knowledge graphs, meaning storing every generated insight as a reusable and owned resource. So a quick example using an anonymized company for demonstration. So imagine a global consumer goods company that has integrated all its scattered research and social listening and R&D data into one insight engine and discovers that there's kind of a hidden relationship between sleep quality and skin health that they didn't know about before. And it's a connection that never surfaced in their traditional reports. And instead of buying static insights, the company now has this intelligence system that is learning and surfacing new opportunities over time and able to uncover that kind of adjacency. So just to give you a kind of quick made up example there of how we think about that insights differentiation. Second pillar is this idea of the adaptive living portfolio, which is less of an idea now, and I think more of a reality in practice at some of the companies that we work with that are a little more advanced in their AI maturity when it comes to the innovation function. But this is down to a lot of innovation functions still managing their portfolios as linear funnels. So ideas enter, they move through stage gates, and they either progress or die. But that model doesn't reflect how markets move anymore. And what AI does is it enables us to manage innovation as a living portfolio. So constantly updating as an ecosystem and sensing change and adjusting accordingly. So it starts with continuous opportunity sensing, keeping an eye on real-time data like market demand, competitor launches, supply chain changes, social sentiment, all this early feedback that becomes the early warning system for emerging opportunities, but also emerging risks. We also have dynamic scoring and reprioritization, which essentially means that instead of a fixed criteria, AI is continuously reevaluating opportunities based on the latest inputs. Active portfolio optimization is simulating what is happening when you actually reallocate those resources, so how each decision is affecting growth, profitability, risk sometimes. And then lastly, balancing horizons, meaning that we're not just chasing short-term wins, but the operating system is keeping near-term revenue aligned with longer-term strategic plays, which is always a difficult tension within innovation functions. So making sure the portfolio is staying balanced over time to the best of the ability within an organization. This is a tension that I think has accelerated quite a bit more with the economic environment over the last couple of years. But the big shift is moving from this once a quarter review process to a live, always on model where intelligence is keeping the portfolio in sync with the market, essentially. So a practical example of how portfolio intelligence is extending beyond this, beyond kind of new concepts into in-market optimization is some work that we've done with a global consumer goods company whose targets really depend not just on upcoming launches, but on the performance of products released in recent years, like most innovation teams at the corporate level. So we built an AI capability that monitors competitor activity at the SKU level in real time. So it's tracking changes in pricing and claims and distribution and positioning right down to the SKU level. So when a competitor adjusts a claim or runs a price promotion, the operating system is instantly detecting that shift and recommending a counteraction. And the result is this adaptive innovation portfolio where existing products and recently released products are treated as kind of active experiments, not just static outcomes. So it keeps the portfolio continuously optimized, essentially. The third pillar is the idea of testing innovation before launch. And there's a lot that falls under this one. We're going to touch on it a little bit, but perhaps in the future, we'll do kind of a deep dive on all things validation related. But AI is changing not just the speed of validation, but really the nature of validation. So validation has typically happened pretty late, meaning you invest in prototypes, you then test them with small samples or pilots or consumer studies. And what we're seeing now is the ability to simulate those same conditions upfront before anything is built. So it starts with dynamic consumer testing, meaning models that are trained on years of behavioral data, purchase data, attitudinal data, and we're creating synthetic audiences, sometimes digital twins, sometimes dynamic personas that are evolving as new data flows in. But it gives teams a much more accurate and segmented view of who they're ideating for, and it lets them run hundreds of test iterations instantly, right down to extremely detailed regional segmentation. Next is in-market simulation environments, which essentially is multi-agent models that are mirroring real market systems. So allowing you to run what-if experiments and ask, what if a competitor enters early? What if raw materials spike? And instead of a static forecast, you have a range of possible outcomes to work with. And the last is technical feasibility, viability as well, and sustainability we're seeing a lot more of as well. I think sometimes sustainability gets left by the wayside in favor of technical feasibility, viability, and desirability, but AI, I think, has actually brought it back to the forefront. But all of these tend to move upstream, meaning AI can analyze things like design conformance and ingredients and material and production data, and can even start to test supply chain resilience before an engineer even starts to prototype. And what this does is it creates a live validation loop. So ideas are tested in real world conditions that are simulated. They can often be predictive, and they're continuously learning, which gives teams just a much bigger head start in knowing what is viable, what is desirable, and what is responsible as well before investing in development. So a hypothetical here would be, imagine a global automotive company that has a virtual test market spanning 12 regions. They test 60 electric vehicle concepts. They identify 2 that show the strongest resilience specifically under fuel and policy changes. And they're able to go to market, or they're able to test, and prototype before wasting, with automotive, usually millions in terms of wasted development. So the takeaway is that simulation is replacing assumption, meaning it's giving innovators real world evidence before they actually head to the real world. And this is really helping reduce failure rates, development time, and a lot in costs as well. This is not a replacement for real world testing by any means. We are not saying, although we have seen clients actually go straight to markets in test markets with this, but typically what we see is much more common is that it's making sure that the teams that actually are prototyping and testing in the real world have much, much more validated concepts. They have a much higher success rate. They are wasting less time and less investment dollars in concepts that weren't rigorously tested enough. And then the fourth and the final pillar is kind of dynamic opportunity sizing and foresight. And these two kind of lived separately before, but we are starting to see them merge in the way that a lot of our clients are building AI native innovation functions. And essentially it's deciding where to play and when to scale. So we've seen folks relying for decades now, I'd say, on your classic TAM, your SAM, your SOM, all extremely important still. They're usually built on these one-time data points and these assumptions that sometimes are recent, oftentimes they've gone stale, pretty quickly. And what AI is doing is transforming this into a more adaptive foresight system. So connecting things like internal performance data with live external signals. And what that does is it recalculates these kind of market boundaries and these adoption curves and the demand potential essentially in real time. These lived in a pretty siloed way before. They were pretty separate, but AI is pulling them together in kind of this super capability where you can also not just size, but detect these pre-signals. You can start to size adjacent markets in a much more dynamic way. You can catch these really early weak indicators that suggest maybe the early formation of a new category. You can run multi-scenario models as well. It's a really interesting space that is evolving very, very fast. Of the four pillars of AI native innovation, meaning where we're seeing so much work and activity in this space and where we are seeing objectively the baseline has massively kind of elevated in the last couple of years. This one of the four is probably the most recent, but also I'd say one of the most exciting and promising. So essentially letting you predict market potential in real time with a much more evidence-based view. All right, those are the four pillars there. We're going to chat a little bit about the human side of this and what this means for innovation teams.
Exactly. And so this is all great. This is very, very exciting. Well, for me, it's very exciting. But the big question that we get from our clients and the big question that we ourselves are asking is, where does the human innovator actually fit into an AI native? That we see it is we kind of fit right in the center, but in a really interesting way. When AI kind of takes on more of the signal sensing, the modeling, the simulation work, the human role actually moves more upstream and across towards things like orchestration, towards judgment, towards direction setting. And so the human role doesn't actually shrink, but rather the human role shifts. And the way that we're seeing it kind of spanning out today is there are four kind of key focus areas for how innovators actually fit within an AI native organization. And so the first area is human beings or innovators are more strategic. They are setting the kind of ethical directions. So we're defining more about what is a problem that AI should be solving for. What does good look like? What should those guardrails be? What data should we be kind of using? What logic should the model be employing, et cetera? And all of that within the context of the company you're in, the brand, purpose, ethics, kind of long-term commercial strategy. So we're seeing a real shift towards human beings being more on the strategic and the ethical side and really setting the direction of these innovation engines. The second area is around kind of orchestrating across disciplines. We've sort of touched on it before, but innovation is now kind of spanning across insights and R&D and marketing and commercialization. And we see innovators actually being the connectors across each of these functions. And we're seeing that innovators are in charge of or need to kind of ensure that the intelligence flows across all of these functions and translate kind of human outcomes rather than, and business outcomes rather than just translating kind of specific isolated experiments. The third thing that we're seeing is the rise of new types of positions that combine creativity, analytics, and systems thinking. So, for example, we're looking at simulation architects, we're looking at data stewards, we're looking at strategic modelers. And in other words, kind of innovators basically become the builders and the translators between AI and AI logic and business outcomes. And last but definitely not least, we're seeing innovators being more involved in kind of acceleration and market connection. And when we say acceleration, market connection, we're really thinking about how validation cycles are so much faster now. And so innovation teams are able to move closer to prototyping and go to market. So it goes back to the point that we made before around how the lines are blurring between innovation and marketing and kind of early commercialization. And innovators are now part of that entire loop, from actually kind of being the originators of the idea, validating it, and kind of launching it. So it's that entire kind of loop. And so that's what we mean when we say AI native human capability. It's one where human beings aren't competing with machines, but rather they're designing how the intelligence actually works across the enterprise. And so this brings us to one topic around judgment. And one thing that we've been hearing a lot is that the human beings will always be the one to provide the judgment. But we're seeing kind of another truth emerge, and that is that AI is already quite advanced in certain forms of judgment, not all, of course, but judgment in the form of kind of connecting different variables, weighing probabilities, recognizing weak signals across kind of millions of data points. And so the human role isn't only focused on judgment and having better judgment, but rather the human role also is about designing the conditions in which the judgment happens. So that actually translates into kind of defining which questions are worth asking, deciding what kinds of data should inform the model, how we can kind of govern kind of the evidence, and how that evidence can then translate into action. And so judgment itself will not disappear, but it just shifts into individuals designing how judgment is made, and kind of sometimes the AI taking over and making those decisions itself.
So one thing we haven't talked about so much is the metrics side of things, and this is actually one that I think is pretty straightforward based on what we've seen. There seem to be kind of three clear metrics that are measurable, identifiable, and ultimately are what a lot of the leadership teams at companies that we work with really care about. So the first is success rate, meaning real-time validation and things like predictive modeling, increasing confidence in every investment. So reducing uncertainty, replacing assumptions with evidence, and leading to more accurate concept selection and a higher percentage of launches that perform successfully in market. And there are different ways of measuring this. There's in-market success, yes, but we also do a lot of traditional testing, meaning testing these concepts against things like Bayes and Ipsos to see how they perform. And what's been really interesting is that they tend to perform a lot better than traditionally the concepts that have come out of a traditional innovation flow, which is super interesting. Second is defensibility. So each model, each data set, each decision framework becomes proprietary IP, which makes it basically a set of intelligence assets that competitors can't replicate. And over time, this becomes a pretty big structural advantage. It means that your innovation capability itself is becoming a defensible moat. And then the third, obviously, is speed. So teams move faster, not by cutting corners, but I actually working with clarity, knowing where to focus, what to drop early. And these three kind of reinforce each other. But that's what we've seen in terms of the three key metrics of a successful AI native innovation capability. So the last slide here is, if this sounds exciting, if this feels like something that is an opportunity for your innovation team, what do you do next? You don't have to follow these four, but typically what we have seen kind of be effective as a starting point is to look at experimentation. Start small, figure out where intelligence could add real value. This is actually less about the technology and more about identifying which parts of your innovation process would benefit the most from evidence-based decision-making. Second is connecting different fragmented internal, external, third-party data sources into the beginning of a unified insight system. The third is either integrating or redesigning your innovation flow once that data foundation is in place. The workflows themselves can start to be redesigned to make intelligence more central rather than peripheral. Some folks prefer to mirror the existing innovation flow with the AI native capability. And then the last is orchestrating, where it all comes together, the data, the teams, the processes, into this adaptive framework that is sensing learning, and guiding decisions across the enterprise. So each of these stages builds capability, it builds confidence, and the companies that do this well tend to treat this kind of intelligence not as a bolt-on tool set, but as more of an operating system for growth. So, quick recap of those 4 pillars here: insight differentiation, portfolio intelligence, simulation and validation, and opportunity sizing and foresight. And again, it's not as clean cut as each of these, but hopefully these give you some insight into the kind of work that we are seeing out there in the spaces and the impact that it is having on the innovation function as a whole. So that was a lot of information that we gave you. We appreciate everyone sticking with us throughout it. And I think we have some time left for questions, I believe.
We do, Amir. We have about 10 to 12 minutes left, and there is a conversation in the chat happening right now around gaining buy-in from the C-suite and from leadership. And so a really specific question related to that. How do you gain buy-in from senior leadership with limited appreciation of how to approach this or even the capability of AI tools?
The kind of perpetual question, as always, it obviously does differ company to company, but I think that one of those last points we made was around not starting with the technology, but starting by looking at where in your process being able to make more evidence-based decisions would have a tangible impact. I don't think it's particularly effective to start with technology, to be honest, because it's not about the technology, it's about what it's solving. So if you can identify parts in your process where you feel that you are having to be assumption-based, where you feel like you are having to rely on data that is static or maybe outdated, where you feel like you have got static personas, for example, that were created a year ago that may no longer be relevant, or you have personas for the US market that you're trying to apply to the Brazil market because you haven't been able to create those personas. All of these are examples of areas that are a little easier as a starting point when it comes to getting that kind of executive level buy-in. So one is presenting the evidence-backed portions of the process. Something else we've seen be pretty effective is actually the combination around insight parity and defensible assets. This is an interesting time, I think, for, I'll use consumer goods as an example. We are coming out of the era of D2C, where D2C really disrupted large companies in a pretty big way. Now what we're seeing with AI is you're kind of seeing the favor swinging back to the big companies because they have so much data and now can start to think about how they make that data defensible, how they turn it into a proprietary asset, how they can train models on it that smaller companies maybe could not do. So there's also a really interesting executive level conversation around this idea of proprietary insights. Instead of buying insights, you can generate insights. So one is the evidence-backed decision points. Another conversation to have is around defensibility of your innovation function. But I will say many different ways to have this conversation. If anyone in the audience is trying to figure out what the right endpoint could be for you, definitely send myself and Natasha an email, and we're happy to jump on a call and have a conversation around what could be right for you.
Awesome. The second question that had a lot of interest in is a lot of kind of our thoughts and our insights focused or seem to focus around kind of B2C industries. How do you think about kind of B2B and innovation evolving and adapting in those industries? And how do you see the role of AI in these sectors?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. So we do a lot of work in the B2B space as well. And I think a lot of what we have discussed today still holds. There are different sets of data points, but the framing around thinking about insights, around thinking about how to simulate different offerings, different services, different marketing campaigns in different regions, different commercial approaches in different regions still holds. So a lot of today, I think, did show some more consumer-based examples, but the majority of what we've shown, if not everything, I do think still holds for the B2B work that we have been doing as well. I think the big shift is probably in the data points, where it's just a different set of data points. And I will say there are fewer data points for B2B than exist for B2C.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one last question is, do you find culture is still one of the hardest layers to quantify in these intelligence systems? So Amir, you go, and then I have some thoughts myself.
Yeah, and I think this is meaning external cultural shifts versus internal innovation culture.
Yeah.
Both of which can be difficult. Yes, so this is a whole conversation in of itself, and I know Tash, you've got a lot of experience in this space as well. I think this is where intrinsic motivators becomes really, really interesting, and where regional variance becomes really interesting as well. It was very hard at scale for humans to be able to effectively monitor culture for global organizations, especially when you have so many markets and culture moving in different ways in those markets. So what AI has really helped with is being able to monitor the sheer scale of cultural shifts. But I think when it comes to the actual quality of the insight itself, what I found really exciting is actually the intrinsic motivator space. It's especially helpful when it comes to social listening and getting a sense not of what specifically people or businesses are buying, but why they're buying, how they're feeling, what their emotional sentiment is. And that's created a much more resilient cultural intelligence layer than saying, here is what people are talking about in terms of a service, a business, a product.
I think to add on that, there are two things. One is we've been kind of deep diving into the social sciences and really thinking about how do you quantify that social science such that an AI human kind of dual combination will be able to look at cultural signals and interpret them. So think about kind of behavioral economics, anthropology, psychology. So we're working on kind of quantifying what that looks like so that we can kind of interpret signals and actually create kind of a cultural intelligence layer. So I think that's kind of one way to also go about doing it. The second thing is, as AI is advancing, we're seeing a lot more kind of multimodality. Wow, the word has escaped me. But we're not only able to interpret text, we're able to interpret voice, we're able to interpret video as well. And the combination of that really helps with understanding not only what is being said, but the deeper whys behind, the context behind what we're seeing. And so we're seeing that kind of say-do gap decrease quite a bit the better AI is getting at understanding and interpreting videos, for example, and voice and text all together in a greater context. So that's also a way in which we kind of quantify that cultural layer.
Yeah. I love that. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question. We've got a big red bar at the top of our screen telling us that we're running out of time. But someone did ask, Carlos Lopez asked, when an AI native organization wants to include human innovators, how does the paradigm of human in the loop come into the automated innovation engine? The reason I wanted to answer this question is because sometimes when I think we talk about or people think about an innovation engine, it does look like this automated process that almost gives you an output at the end, a lot of evidence along the way, and then you get this output. But the reality is that the human in the loop is designed at every single stage of this process. And what we see when this is in action, actually, Tash and I are flying out to work with the clients' brand teams this week to see it in action, is that people interrogate really different parts of the process. So we've seen a lot of people spend a lot of time on interrogating the insights, really digging into those insights, iterating on them, pushing them in different directions. We see a lot of people interrogating the opportunity spaces a lot, the hunches, the clues. Obviously, people interrogate concepts a lot as well. We see a lot of people spending time on the dynamic personas and really saying, okay, this is really interesting feedback from this persona around specific problem solution fit in this country. I actually want to ask more about that and learn more about that, and then plug that back into the flow and think about concepts specifically for that need. So it's a lot less automated, and it is really cool to see where different client teams spend their time in the process, and it kind of speaks to the different capabilities and also cultures at different organizations when you see where they're really making use of the capability. All right. So I think that is all that we have time for, unfortunately, today. But these are really, really great questions. So I appreciate everyone joining us. Appreciate everyone asking questions. I will put Tash and I's email address back on the screen now in case you have any additional questions and want to reach out to us. We're always happy to jump on a call and kind of continue the conversation. So thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesdays, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.